Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here, and I'm very pleased that my book is available in French. In fact, 2 weeks ago I was in Cambodia, in Phnom Penh, because somebody wanted to translate the book into Khmer, which I thought was even more fascinating than to have it in French. You have already seen this during the trials, but this, I guess, is my main message. When you are in Asia, where I have been for the last 2 months at the Tun Ismail Ali Chair of the University of Malaysia, what is it that they don't have in Asia? Well, they don't have an axis from left to right upon which every idea has to be placed. Right? And that's a great advantage. That is a great advantage. Of course, there is a right-left axis in the sense that once upon a time, society was divided into those who owned the factories and their allies, and those who worked in the factories. Right? So that was, I think, a useful axis to have. But now there's so many other axes. And I suggest that we try to organize our thoughts on economic policy along a different line. Physiocracy, which has to do with free trade. It's fortune, not virtu. And if you've seen the picture of Fortune, she's blind. She's blindfolded, right? For a reason. Is that, that's a sign of whether you want to be on her side or with somebody who uses her eyesight. And inevitably, this will lead to speculation and financial crisis. So we shouldn't really be discussing protectionism without discussing financial crisis. Because the type of economic policy that understands that it's important what kind of economic activity you're in, that kind of economic policy also understands that you have to control the financial sector. So I suggest that we should try to look at the alternative, the kind of policy we want, as anti-physiocracy. You need an industrial policy, maybe because of an extremely successful industrial policy of the past. For 50 years, it doesn't look like you need an industrial policy. But that was just because the policy of the past was so successful that it lasted. And this idea of virtu, you need its focus on production, and there is a need to control the financial sector. Right? So I think these, if you look at economic history, there is a movement between these two. And when the physiocracy theory gets too much power, you have a type of moment which I call 14th of July moment or 1848 moment. Both the French Revolution and 1848, the revolutions, were reactions to too much free trade, too much belief in the market. Right? And the reaction to 1848 was, on one side, Marx and Lenin's Communist Manifesto. We know that Marx was so radical that he had to move to England. But there was also the first shot of the German historical school, of Mr. Hildebrandt, who was so conservative he had to flee to Switzerland. So there was a reaction on both political ends. And the third 1848 book was John Stuart Mill, the classical liberal. They were all against free trade. Right? John Stuart Mill, the classical liberal, is against free trade under certain conditions. And I think this is the kind of understanding we have to get back to. And the other kind of 1848 moment is the 14th of July moment. And I have, my expert on this is Professor Stephen Kaplan, who's sitting here in the back, is the greatest expert, I think, on the economics behind the French Revolution. You know, the French Revolution broke out. I shouldn't tell you, but I think this is something I've been digging into. The French Revolution broke out on the day that the news reached Paris that the last anti-physiocrat, Mr. Necker, had lost his job as a Minister of Finance. So the French Revolution broke out as a result of too much belief in the market, that you could actually make much more money by speculating in the price of wheat than you could in baking bread, supplying the people of Paris. So there is a free trade speculation element here, which we have also today. You know, I think we are now in a situation where there is more money to be made in speculating for food prices going up than to produce anything, right? So we have a 14th of July moment coming up, I think, on the world level. And if we go back in theory here, I think the first person that actually described the needs for industrial policy is a Frenchman, Barthélemy de la Fama, who was the tailor to Henry IV. I was looking for these pamphlets for 20 years. I think there are about 5 in the world I've looked up. And it's a fascinating volume, and some of these, there is an explanation of why you need industrial policy. Question and answering session in the end, 1597. It's a great book. Then, a few years later, Antonio Serra, which was mentioned by Claude, he's the first economist to tell you why. You know, this guy says this is how you should do because then so-and-so happens. Well, Serra told us why it happens. It has to do with increasing returns, and it has to do with a great division of labor. These people would go into a city, they would count the number of professions, and the larger the number of professions, the richer was the city. So it was an idea that the division of labor, the degree of division of labor, meant wealth. And I think this, you can still do that in the world today and get the same result. I think a departure point here is that the West is losing out. You see here the statements by the dean of the Singapore Business School, which Claude have already mentioned. The Asia is beating us in our own game, because we have unlearned, Europe has unlearned how we got rich, therefore they are actually beating us in our own game. And this is similar to the reaction when Italy started declining in the 16th century. They were saying, oh, the French and the English are beating us in our own game. So this is a cyclical thing. So that when nations are very successful, they unlearn the reasons for their own success. And if they don't learn them in time, you know, they're in trouble. So I think this is a useful insight from Asia. And having spent just 2 months in Asia myself, traveling around, I think this is right. And the important thing from my point of view is that I don't think that this is something that the right-left axis can do something about. But if we look back at the right-left axis of the 1930s, both the far left and the far right and the conservatives were anti-physiocrats. You know, both the communist empire and German Nazis and some decent conservative people in the middle were all for industrial policy. So the interesting thing is that at one point everyone understood financial crisis from far left to far right, including Rudolf Hilferding, who was a Jew, who wrote the book about it. And now nobody understands it. So there are cycles of economic development which are tied to cycles of theory. And I think we can say that the physiocrats, they lost all historical battles except one. And that's the battle in the textbooks of economic history and history of economic thought. That's the only place they won, in the books that our students read. but in real life, you know, the anti-physiocrats won. So we'll move on. If we look at the development of GDP, we see that in many areas the period from 1950 to 1973 was a golden era. That's when economic growth was doing its best, was at its best. And then Russia here, former USSR, is doing miserably well, and only Asia is doing well. And I think this is what we have to face up to, right? That things are not going very well in production. Perhaps in the financial market they are, but not in production. So we also have these questions that economists are not very good at answering. You know, when I was back in school in Oslo, there was a country called Somalia, which was richer than a country called Korea. And then something happened. And it was not that Korea were suddenly so much more efficient in growing rice, which is what they used to do. You know, they had an industrial policy. Right? And Korea, in a remarkably short time, became one of the richest countries in the world, based on their industrial policy. But this is something that theoretical economists normally have a problem recognizing. Right? And now, you know, Somalia is specializing in a comparative advantage of being poor, and therefore also go into illegalities. This is my very complicated version of the history of economic thought. This is my answer to Paul Samuelson's family tree. And you see there's an English branch to the left there. This all comes out of Renation. An English branch, there's an Italian branch with Botero and Serra. There is a French branch with Laffemas and Colbert. We don't have time to talk about Colbert, but Colbert in many ways wrote the book about this. And von Honeck and others in Germany. And this all develops, and today this is what I call the other canon, which is the type of economic theory which is based on facts.
I must apologize. Ici, vous avez caméralisme allemand. C'est le nom du mercantilisme allemand. Malheureusement, dans la version imprimée du livre, vous avez cannibalisme allemand. Alors,
I have to say, I thought that was of all Freudian misprints, that was the best I've ever seen.
Je pense qu'on va prendre
Cannibalisme allemand.
Un procès pour germanophobie par une ligue de vertu. Donc, moi-même, les éditions du Rocher, nous excusons pour cette coquille.
Fortunately, so many of my economic heroes are German that I don't think it will affect me. I think it's one important fact we have to remember, that no nation, with the possible exception of Hong Kong, if you can call it a nation, has ever grown rich without a period of protectionism. You know, England protected from the 1400s until well into the 19th century. The Americans protected for 120 years. The French have put it on and off for a long time. Perhaps Korea only did it for 40 or 50 years. But this has been a mandatory passage point from poverty to wealth. You know, economists, they don't like that fact. But it is a fact. And I don't think we have to face up to it. And it's not that in spite of their stupid policies they got rich, which tends to be the explanation of American economists. Well, yes, America got rich in spite of its silly policies, which I don't think we should buy. So this strategy of turning protectionism on and off is the most important decision a nation can make. And it's very difficult because it is a trade-off. You cannot say that if you make that decision, everyone will win. Very often the consumers would lose, but the same persons being producers will win. So it's not obvious, but it's an argument we have to face in its complexity, and actually in so many other things in life, we have to live with these trade-offs. So the starting point of protectionism is that economic activities are qualitatively different, right? We all understand that. Economists don't say to their daughters, "My daughter, you are so good at washing dishes, I think you should stick to your comparative advantage and get a job washing dishes in a restaurant." They don't say that to their children, but they say it to nations, right? And this is a problem. If we say that we put all the people in Paris who clean hospitals in one country and put all the people who are surgeons in Paris hospitals in another country, we're not getting factor price equalization. We are getting factor price polarization, right? And I think we should, when economic theory goes right in the face of common sense, I think we should take some time to listen to common sense, right? And this has been done, as I say, both right and left. So we have to couple this intuitive thing in. So there are good and bad economic activities. Good activities have increasing returns, bad activities have diminishing returns, which means that at one point, after you specialize, costs go up. That happens always in agriculture, in mining, and in fisheries. But it doesn't happen in industry. You have dynamic, imperfect competition, which creates wealth. Bill Gates is facing dynamic, imperfect competition. He's rich. Somebody who paints a house doesn't face that competition and is poor. Stable prices, great fluctuation of prices, qualified labor, unqualified labor creates a middle class, and what the lack of industry creates, I think in this case, some kind of neo-feudalism. I call it post-industrial feudalism. And if you look at Russia, post-industrial, the Russians like that term because they feel, this says something about what's happening here. Reversible wages versus wages which are normally not reversible. If you have technical change, wages go up, versus if you have technical change, prices go down. Great synergy versus no synergy. In the countryside where everybody produces milk, they don't buy and sell milk to each other, there's very little synergy. Big difference for the city. The problem in this is that we can't describe this logic within traditional trade theory, because traditional trade theory is based on the exchange of labor hours. That was the big trick of David Ricardo. Ricardo's theory was made in order to convince the rest of the world that they should not industrialize. And the way they did that was to say, okay, if you take labor hours, we can prove that people who stick to their comparative advantage, that would be an advantage for the whole world. But the trick is that it's based on labor hours. One labor hour in an Amazon primitive tribe equals one labor hour in Silicon Valley, right? And the Americans always says, we're not that gullible. We don't buy that, right? And I don't think we should buy it either. I mean, there's some great arguments for free trade, and increasing returns is one of them, because you get bigger markets. So it's not that they're not arguments for free trade, but what is an argument for free trade is also, in a sense, an argument against free trade. If you don't have the increasing returns, you may not have, maybe you shouldn't have free trade. And the Americans used this quotation from the Bible, which I kind of like, because it says, it describes that there is some kind of hierarchy out there, right? Then at the top you have the qualified people, and at the bottom you have those who are drawers of water and ewers of of wood. You know, the people who supplied water and firewood to the tribes of Israel were at the bottom of the hierarchy, right? And the problem is that if you don't have an industrial policy, you may end up at the bottom of the hierarchy. You may end up like the drawers of wood. So I think this is a kind of logic that we can use again. Back to the trade-off I was thinking about. You know, the Americans, when they started industrializing in the 1820s, they made it very clear that in the short run, protectionism will bring up the price of goods. No doubt about that. In the short term, we are penalizing the consumer. But in society, we all play two roles, don't we? We're on the one side, we're producers, and on the other side, we are consumers. So this intelligent protectionism is based on a trade-off between man the consumer and man the producer. We are penalizing in the short run through higher prices the consumer, but the same person as the producer will be more than compensated for that loss. You know, this is actually the argument. So if we think of the situation of 1817, when Ricardo wrote his book, the equilibrium position would have been, without industrial policy, was that England would have been the only rich country in the world, and the rest of us would have been poor, right? This is the kind of logic that lies behind the Ricardo's theory. So, in a sense, the two kinds of efficiencies. There is the short-term efficiency of a company, but you're sacrificing the short-term efficiency of a company in order to have a kind of global efficiency which produces more welfare, right? So it's a welfare maximizing efficiency, which is not the same as the very narrow short-term efficiency of companies. So we can have a poverty equilibrium. You know, this is kind of logic that Keynes was very convincing about in the 1930s. I put up a list here of good and bad protectionism.
In the book.
It is in the book. It's complicated, but I think fully understandable. And the interesting thing here is that even stupid protectionism, like Latin American and Indian protectionism, which was not very intelligent, actually produced better welfare than no protectionism at all. So you have to go. You have to go into the book and look at this. I already talked about the French Revolution, and I think it's important to say that there are two different types of protectionism around. One is the aggressive one, in order to get into high-tech markets, what we have with industry. But we also have what I call a defensive protectionism, which is the kind of protectionism we have in agriculture. You know, the logic behind agricultural protectionism is completely different from that in industry. It's really to help our national farmers against poorer and perhaps even more efficient farmers abroad. That's why the US and the EU are have tremendous bills for protecting their agriculture. I've tried to make a list of how economic activities are different, how they are qualitatively different, what determines that. That's also in the book, but too complicated. So my theory is that we have to get back to the old wisdom, and the old wisdom has disappeared actually because it's impossible to formalize it with the tools of economics. You know, there are qualitatively differences here which are very difficult, which cannot be written in mathematics. So we have a boomerang effect, that the kind of economic theory that we in the West convinced our colonies about in order to colonize them, now they are boomeranging. As the Americans say, the chickens are coming home to roost. We're getting our own mistakes thrown in our face. So what we have to do is to reinvent the theories of the 1945 to 1973. So I'll one more slide, and I'll make Claude happy here.
Question.
You know, people are now calling everything wrong in the world for market failure. This was a couple of days ago. This is everything which is wrong is a market failure. The financial crisis is a market failure. No, it's a theory failure. You know, we have to stop them on that. We have to stop them saying that this is market failure. It's actually a failure of theory. So what we can choose here is the West. We can choose if we want to decline as Amsterdam did in the 1700s. Both Amsterdam and the Italian cities were declining. Amsterdam was no longer then the richest country in the world, but it was still rich. It kept producing, right? So declining relatively is not that bad. But if we choose to decline like Venice, we will become a museum. Venice first lost its production, and then for a while finance, before moving to Amsterdam, were actually hanging in. But it did result in a decline. I think this is in extremis. These are the choices facing us. And what we know from Latin America is how income distribution looks in a deindustrialized country. This is income distribution in Peru from 1950 to 1990. As long as they produce these data, you see that when there was an industrial country, the real wages and the income of the self-employed was 80% of GDP. You know, this box is 100%. And then when the country was deindustrialized, wages fell dramatically, the income of the self-employed fell dramatically, and what we had was a huge growth of the financial sector. This is what's happening in the United States. You know, one of my colleagues is saying, well, he's waiting for the financial sector to be bigger than government. This is the trend, right? So we know what's happening in Europe, fortunately, because we have a dress rehearsal in Latin America, and we had a dress rehearsal in Russia, where also, if you look at income distribution before and after the free trade shock, it looks like that. And I think this is something that should worry both the political right and the political left. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Y a-t-il des questions? Il y a des papiers qui ont circulé, voilà. Donc, des questions, pour savoir si vous voulez décliner comme Amsterdam ou décliner comme Venise.
We can have a vote.
oui, on peut voter. Mais ça peut être dans les programmes, dans certains programmes politiques. Alors, pourquoi why a weak currency and industrial politic without protectionism is not sufficient? It is not enough. Autre question? You can answer directly? A weak currency and political industrial without protectionism is not sufficient.
Well,
pourquoi là? Je rappelle pour tout le monde.
Yeah.
Pourquoi une monnaie faible et une politique industrielle sans protectionnisme n'est-elle pas suffisante?
I think in certain circumstances it can be sufficient. But in the 1930s we had protectionism. And protectionism made it possible to invest profitably and create jobs. What we have now, instead of protectionism, is currency wars, right? And currency war is a substitute for protectionism. And currency wars creates nothing but opportunities for the financial sector to make profits. It doesn't create any jobs outside the financial sector. So I think we should keep in mind that, you know, we have mechanisms, but the mechanisms we have now are much more negative than the mechanisms we had. In some cases, industrial policy can be enough, and a weak currency can be enough. But look at Brazil. They try to keep their currency weak, but you know they're in dead trouble because of the speculation. So it, you know, I would say it depends on the degree of speculation. If if you can keep your jobs without protectionism, nothing is better than that. But I don't think it's enough in many cases.
When Brazil imposed Apple to build a factory on the side, is that intelligent protectionism? When
I mean, normally, what countries tell international business is, if you want to sell here, you have to put up a factory. I mean, no example is clearer than Canada. You know, all the American companies that wanted to export from the United States to Canada, and the Canadians said, well, if you want to sell here, you have to put up a factory, right? So I think that can be intelligent protectionism. You know, if you get hold of a key company and then clusters around it. In Penang, in Malaysia, they're very good at this, with little niches like lead light and medical equipment. You know, getting a big company and then get the cluster around it is a good idea. And what the country has is some kind of bargaining power, because there are a lot of consumers. So the bargaining power, you know, if you want our consumers, well, then you have to. You can also have a competition. You know, who bids the most?
S'il vous plaît, professeur,
yeah.
Est-ce que vous ne croyez pas que c'est exactement ce qui se passe avec la Chine, où on fait un transfert de technologie pour faire tourner nos industries? Don't you think it's exactly what's happening with China, where we make a transfer of technology? It's the case with Alstom, with Airbus, with many of our main industries, which are migrating slowly to Asia.
Yes, and they're playing this game very well. And if you look at what the French said about the Dutch for a long time, and that these Dutch are not good at anything but copying our goods, you know, this is the history repeating itself, and they're doing it well. And I think the difference between Japan and China is that Japan came to a halt because they didn't do enough basic research. You know, now you see that China is getting into basic research, and I think doing things very well. Unfortunately, their wages have been kept low for a long time, which is logical from an internal Chinese point of view, but it's, you know, too bad for us. So when I actually wrote the foreword to the Chinese edition, I said, maybe it is in the interest of China to let Europe and the United States protect, because you want to keep the purchasing power of your customers in Europe and the United States. So let them protect enough to keep their wages at this level, which this is in your interest. You don't want poor customers. I don't know if it works, but I think it's also in the interest of China, really.
There is a tough question. How your theory, how much is it really able to integrate the demographic evolution, and notably the suicide of countries such as Japan and Russia also today, and soon perhaps China.
The suicide, demographic suicide.
The demographic suicide, of course.
Yeah. Well, normally when, you know, population decrease for two reasons.
I was asked to, because a lot of people here maybe don't understand very well English. Yep. So as a matter of fact, if you don't mind, you will say one or two sentences, and I will try to translate for the public. Okay.
Normally, in rich countries, the net reproduction rate, how many children people have, go down with increasing wealth.
En général, dans les pays industrialisés où la richesse est importante, plus la richesse est importante et plus le nombre d'enfants par famille diminue, tend à diminuer.
Look at northern Italy.
Regardez le nord de l'Italie par rapport au sud.
And there is a logic here that if there is no social security and people are poor, if a couple needs 3 children for their old age, and infant mortality is 50%, it's logical to have at least 6 children.
Et le professeur explique dans sa théorie que ceci est logique dans les pays où il y a peu de protection sociale, à partir du moment où, comme il y a peu de protection sociale, les familles ont besoin d'avoir plusieurs enfants pour prendre soin d'eux lors de leur vieillesse, je dirais. Et comme il y a peu de protection sociale, la mortalité infantile est relativement élevée. Et donc, à partir de là, en considérant une mortalité infantile relativement élevée, c'est pour ça qu'il y a un taux de natalité qui est plus important.
Yeah. So therefore, you get people from poor countries moving to rich countries, for this demographic reason. And I think if we want to stop that, and the only reason to stop it is to industrialize the poor countries. Then that's the only way to stop the flow.
Et la seule façon d'arrêter ce processus, c'est d'industrialiser les pays pauvres.
So, but then to the suicide things, but then when a society is in extreme crisis, people stop having children. The classical examples are the Inuit in Canada. When the whole culture is dying, people stop having children. And if you look at the country like Latvia,
Lettonie.
Yeah. Their birth rate is more than half, and 20% of the population has quietly packed their suitcases and left.
Quand on prend des pays comme la Lettonie, explique le professeur, il y a la moitié de la population le taux de natalité s'est carrément effondré et les gens ont quitté le pays.
Actually, more than 20%. We read about the Greeks protesting, but we don't read about these demographic crisis elsewhere. And in Russia, of course, there is a similar demographic crisis, which is a big political problem. So demography is complicated, but I think that it has some interesting feedbacks also with industrialization and the lack of it.
Merci.
Chers camarades, si tu veux plus de contenu, de réinformation, d'éducation populaire et de formation intellectuelle, n'hésite pas à faire un don sur notre page Tipeee.